I'm going to leave the introduction of Master Popplewell to Master Schiemann, safe to say that Master Popplewell is a polymath. The law and sport have been most fortunate over his long career to have had an expert in both fields, both separately as a cricketer and also as a lawyer, but in combination on the bench in his inquiry into the Bradford fire disaster and later in the Court of Arbitration of Sport and the Dispute Resolution Panel for Sport. But not content with a distinguished career in this distinction, Master Popplewell is also an accomplished author of several books, and we hear tonight about his latest book, Munich, Why? Master Konrad Schiemann was born in Berlin in 1937, but came to England in 1946, where he completed his education and was called to the bar here in 1962. He was appointed a High Court judge in 1986 and a Lord Justice of Appeal in 1995, and was a judge of the Court of Justice of the European Union between 2004 and 2012. Master Schiemann was treasurer of this inn in 2003 and has been a bencher of Inner Temple for 37 years, only beaten in this respect by Master Popplewell, who is the longest serving bencher at an astonishing 44 years. How lucky we are this evening to be able to hear from both of them, and I'm sure that we're in for a real treat. So I'm going to hand you over now to Master Schiemann and Master Popplewell.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Master Treasurer. I'm conscious that we're here not merely in person, but also, I understand, with a multitude no man can number who are watching us over the internet in one form or another. And that has this advantage that it extends the audience, but it means that it is quite likely that there will be some people there who do not know that to become president of the MCC in England is regarded with the same degree of awe as being the conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic is in Germany. So I hope that our Slovak and Czech friends will forgive us if I just start by asking Oliver a little bit about something which me, quite frankly, as someone of German origins, has always puzzled me. I have been brought into this partly, I think, because I was the nearest they could find to someone of Oliver's age. but partly also, I think, because, as you've heard, my origins are German, and therefore it provides a certain degree of balance to a subject which is likely to raise high passions. I have to explain that the Munich Agreement was entered into round about my first birthday, and I didn't play myself a significant part in it. But there it was. But the family was very much divided because part of it was as Aryan as you could conceivably wish to be, and the other half was regarded by Hitler, in any event, as having been indelibly stained by the fact that one of their admittedly very distinguished ancestors didn't become a Christian until 1820. And so they were stained. And it was very interesting for me recently to read the letters which were being exchanged in the 1930s about my parents marrying each other and what this would do to their respective careers and life chances. But anyhow, so far as Munich is concerned, I think I may be able to provide a certain, I won't say Hitlerian perspective. From time to time, I think I can even do that. I will do my best, but you mustn't think that everything I say is necessarily my own opinion. Now, Oliver, tell us a little bit more about your cricketing background, which puzzles this German.
I was brought up at the age of 11 enjoying cricket and loving it and playing it. And I went to Cambridge, where I was fortunate enough, as an average club cricketer, to play in three very, very able sides. I'll mention one match. If you don't want to know the result, switch off now. It was Cambridge against the West Indies in 1950. On the first day, Cambridge, at tea time on the first day, were over 300 for the loss of 1 wicket. By 12 o'clock on the second day, Cambridge had declared at 590 for 4. Ramadin and Valentine, some will remember, the great twins, took were hit for hundreds of runs and took no wickets. And then the West Indies batted. They batted from lunchtime on the second day until 7:30 on the third day, by which time they had accumulated 700 runs for the loss of 3 wickets. I was not playing in the match. I was a wicketkeeper, and I'd been dropped because I was doing exams. And my substitute, a nice man called Wyn Denman, kept wicket in my place. When West Indies batted, Everton Weekes made over 300 runs, not out. When he was 10, the Wyn Denman managed to drop him, with the result that he went on, as I say, to make 300 runs. My side said to me when I came back, "Come back, Popplewell, all is forgiven," and I stayed on in the team. So that's my cricket background.
Those of you who wish to pursue this further will have the opportunity after we've finished. But I think perhaps to keep in with the appropriate regulations, we ought now to turn to Czechoslovakia. And can I ask you, Oliver, what was it that interested you as an 11-year-old or whatever you were when the agreement was signed? What had interested you in that?
I remember the summer of 1938 vividly, and particularly 2 events. The first was that England made 903 for 7 against Bradman's 11. And secondly, that every time we went to the cinema, there was a newsreel pictures of Chamberlain flying endlessly to see Hitler. I formed the view then that we had behaved shamefully.
You will remember, some of you, reading about, you won't have lived through it, I suspect, Chamberlain's broadcast to the nation in which he said how horrible and incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. And that was a widely held view, I think, in this country at the time. And we were to be distinguished from the French because, unlike the French, who had treaty obligations to the Czechoslovaks, Britain had none. Oliver, when you started writing this book, what were the questions to which you initially wanted an answer and which induced you to research Munich and the Czechoslovaks?
Well, I had no idea where Czechoslovakia was, who the citizens were, or why Germany was threatening the country. I learned that during the 19th century, the Czechs were subject to Austria and the Slovaks to Hungary, and both treated as second-class citizens. They remained so until after the First World War, when in 1918, Czechoslovakia became an independent nation and declared its independence from Austria-Hungary. In 1900, Thomas Masaryk had become leader of the Czech party, and he was instrumental in the foundation of the state.
I think, if I remember rightly, that in addition to Masaryk, there were two other important figures in the search for independence. One was Benesch, who during the war cultivated French Foreign Office officials, and Stefanich was the other, who'd been an astronomer in France and an explorer. But those were the background people, as it were. Now, what were the particular reasons, Oliver, do you think, for the creation of the Czechoslovak state as an independent state?
There were quite a number. One was the collapse of Russia, and the second was the exploits of the Czech Legion. Czech soldiers had been forced into the Austro-Hungarian army. Many were captured by the Russians, who initially treated them as forced labor. After the Russian Revolution, they became part of the Russian army. In 1917, they played an important part in the Battle of Zborov in an offensive against the Germans. The French naturally wanted the Czech legions on the Western Front, and the British wanted them in Central Europe. Eventually, the legions themselves decided to go to Vladivostok. The Czechs decided to occupy the Trans-Siberian Railway and seize the Russian state gold treasure worth 6 million rubles. In October 1918, the provisional government was fully recognized, and Masaryk and Benesch formed the government.
We should, I think, try and recollect the background to the Treaty of Versailles. The German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the Turkish empires had all collapsed by the end of the First World War. The American President Wilson insisted that the treaty should include the principle of self-determination for emerging nations. And the principle of self-determination was of certain attraction to Germans and played a certain part in the arguments about, you will hear about shortly, about the Sudeten Germans who were in what was eventually became Czechoslovakia. Anyhow, the treaty provisions provided for allocating to Czechoslovakia the areas in which the Germans formed a very large majority, and they were known as the Sudeten Germans. Now, the Germans regarded the Treaty of Versailles as shaming them and as disastrous. It firmly allotted responsibility for the war to Germany, made Germany liable for huge compensation payments, deprived them of territories which had long been under German influence, and they, and others indeed, described the Treaty of Versailles as a Carthaginian peace, referring to the peace imposed upon the losing Carthaginian side in the Punic Wars, where they were effectively wiped off the map.
Keynes, in his, quote, economic consequences of the peace treaty, was scathing about it.
Keynes was a member of this inn, wasn't he?
I'm not sure.
No, I think he was.
Discuss. Smuts, who had fought the British in South Africa, wrote, and I quote, "My experience in South Africa has made me a firm believer in political magnanimity. On the other hand, I greatly fear our present panic policy will bring failure on this conference and spell ruin for Europe." During the debate on the Munich crisis in 1938, Harold Nicholson MP spoke. He and his American colleagues had worked out a scheme to give two areas, the Eger and the Asch, to Germany. However, when they suggested this scheme to Lloyd George and President Wilson, they were told that, and I quote, "You are mad. You are going to give Germany territory for having made war against us. It was never German territory."
Well, strongly backed by the French, the Czechs soon established good relations with Soviet Russia. In 1924, the French and the Czechs entered into a treaty of alliance, which provided for both sides to concert their actions in all matters which concerned or threatened their security. However, in the event, measures to safeguard their joint interests were pretty limited. Oliver says in his book that the French view of solemn and binding treaties was, in de Gaulle's words, that they last like young girls or roses. They last as long as they last.
It was not long before events occurred.
Well, it doesn't much matter whether you read this or I do.
Oh, right.
It's taken straight from your book.
Right, well, you go.
Shall we stick to plan?
Yes, sorry.
It was not long before events occurred elsewhere which were to cast a shadow over the future of Czechoslovakia. Britain and France had suffered grievously in the war, but in different ways. Both had different objectives from the peace. Both wanted reparations. France wanted the return of territory, and most particularly, a guarantee against another German invasion such as had occurred in 1914. Large parts of France, you may remember, have been occupied for 4 years. Many of its towns, villages, and major industries were destroyed, and the coal mines flooded. France lost 1.5 million killed and some 700,000 wounded. Now, Britain had not been occupied. Its losses, though substantial, were much less. Its industries had lost markets, however, and its economy was in disarray. What the British wanted was resumption of trade with Germany. But Oliver, I know you're raring to go. Why don't you outline the critical events?
Thank you very much. They were in chronological order: the Treaty of Locarno in 1925, the rise of Hitler in 1926, the demilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the Anschluss, that's the union between Germany and Austria, in 1938, and the Munich Agreement in 1938. We can briefly describe each of them. Locarno, in 1925, Germany, France, Britain, and Italy signed the treaties of Locarno, bypassing the League of Nations. Germany, although it had to continue to pay reparations for the damage inflicted by Germany during the war, was now no longer to be regarded as a vanquished nation. The treaty guaranteed the borders in the West, but was silent about the borders on the East. Germany joined the League of Nations in 1926.
I think it falls to me to mention Mein Kampf and the rise of Hitler. Hitler, it has to be said, made no secret of his intentions. In 1925-26, he wrote, "It cannot be the intention of heaven to give one people 50 times as much land as another." For Germany today, the only solution to Germany's problem of land is by the acquisition of new land in Europe. But where? This was repeated in the so-called Hosbach Memorandum in 1935, which records a meeting of Hitler's military advisors and records him as saying, "Land can only be acquired by force. Look at the British and the Roman empires. The tribes in Austria and Czechoslovakia would be resettled in Siberia or Volhynia, a marshy part of Poland, and replaced by German farmers." Today, some of you might think this would be called ethnic cleansing. A military operation, Operation Green, was planned for the occupation of Czechoslovakia to come into force on the 1st of October 1938.
Why was the occupation of the demilitarized Rhineland such an important part of Hitler's strategy? The fact is that the land to the east of the Rhine was regarded in German literature and song as part of Germany, rather like Alsace and Lorraine regarded in France as part of that nation.
So the occupation of the Rhineland had wider consequences. The fact that there was no opposition by England and France to what the Germans regarded as the reoccupation of the Rhineland was regarded as showing the shrewd judgment of Hitler, who always said there will be no opposition. The German military and those conspiring in Germany against Hitler were proved wrong. They had maintained that France and England would be bound to go to war in the event of reoccupation, and that therefore that reoccupation would be disastrous. But they were proved wrong.
France's economy was in dire straits. The country was very nearly bankrupt. The franc was regularly devalued. It was a peasant economy. In the 1930s, industrial Germany spent twice as much on military equipment as the French. French governments came and went. Between February 1930 and September 1938, there were no fewer than 21 separate prime ministers. On 7th of March 1936, when Germany walked into the Rhineland, France was without a government.
So much for the Rhineland. Now, what other questions began to interest you as you were researching this book?
The level of French incompetence. Chamberlain wrote, quote, "France was never very fortunate in its foreign secretaries. France can never keep a secret for more than half an hour, nor a government for more than 9 months. Laval was described as being like a French peasant who was always thinking of getting the better of someone over the price of a chicken." Another comment, quote, "Veracity is not, I regret to say, the strongest point of the average French politician." Van Sittert of the British Foreign Office wrote of Monsieur Bonnet, the French Foreign Secretary, "If I ever had to play cards with him, I would always run through the pack first to make sure the joker had been duly removed."
You may notice that Oliver has strong feelings about the French. I have to be extremely careful about expressing any such view with my German background, because the Germans on any basis don't emerge as the heroes of this tale. But it is only fair to point out that lack of honesty is not an exclusively French political failure. There were other factors at this time. One was the Franco-Soviet alliance, signed in May 1935, which was a treaty which was conditional on the operation of the Franco-Czechoslovakian alliance. And the Soviets were only committed to support the Czechoslovaks against Germany provided France had already agreed to help the Czechoslovaks. And in the event, there were no serious staff talks between France and Czechoslovakia, only some exchange maneuvers. In April 36, the French admitted that there was nothing now that they could do to help their allies in the East. And as for Russia, help from them was subject to their troops being allowed across Poland and Romania, some chance. Returning to the Rhineland, that Germany was going to march into the Rhineland had been an open secret since the summer of 1935. The French air minister didn't think that the reoccupation constituted an immediate and sudden attack on France. In any event, a general French mobilization would be required to remove the Germans, and a general mobilization would take 5 stages lasting at least a fortnight, and in the event, France did nothing. The immediate effect of this inaction was on France's Eastern allies, who thought that if France couldn't defend itself on this issue, what about the future? The French reaction to the reoccupation was to tell the Czechs to adopt a collective approach to the League of Nations.
The union between Germany and Austria, the Anschluss, and the invasion of the Sudetenland were widely seen in the United Kingdom as a triumph by Hitler, and as showing that he could get away with things provided he was firm enough. In Austria, many welcomed the incorporation. Germany's invasion caused no surprise in France or in Britain, but for the Czechoslovaks it was a final straw. By acquiring this territory, the Germans were able to outflank part of the Czechoslovak fortifications and increase Germany's military strength. France's attitude can be summarized as follows. In February 1938, France set out its military priorities in time of war. 1. Defense of France and empire. 2. Offensive action against Italy in the Alps and in Africa. 3. If possible, and at a convenient time, offensive action against Germany.
What, Oliver, were the major factors which affected the United Kingdom's political decision-maker at the time?
Unlike in 1914, when Britain intervened when Belgium was invaded, Britain had no treaty or other obligations to the Czechoslovaks. The major factors which affected British decision-making were as follows. 1. The armed forces, limitations on expenditure. 2. The strength of the peace lobby. 3. The view of the dominions. And 4. The lack of an effective defence system. Britain had lost valuable markets during the First World War, and at the end of it was virtually bankrupt. Between 1931 and 1938, there was only 1 year, 1935, when there was a favourable balance of payments. Its merchant shipping fleet had been severely depleted. As a nation, Britain needed to trade. Massive unemployment imposed limitations on expenditure, particularly on the armed forces.
So the question then arises, well, what were the United Kingdom's defence preparations at this point? Well, in 1935, the government issued a white paper on defence and approved it in 1936. However, the United Kingdom didn't have the manpower to produce the necessary munitions for its own defense. Major rearmament didn't take place until 1937. Military expenditure by Britain in the 1930s was between less than a third and a quarter of Germany's. Mass production had been part of USA and Germany's industrial methods for years. By contrast, in Britain, industry depended on high-quality individual production. Factories and shipyards had to be built, workmen recruited and trained, but all this was at the expense of exports. Then there was the peace lobby in this country. In 1935, there was a by-election in East Fulham. A Conservative majority at the general election of over 23,000 was overturned, and Labour won with a majority of 4,840. The Times described it as a victory based on the Pacific issue and a defeat for a policy of rearmament. Between then and March 1935, swings against the government varied between 14 and an astonishing 50% at Lambeth North. You have to put yourself into the position of the politicians at the time. The second event was the peace ballot organized in 1935 by the League of Nations Union under Lord Cecil and Gilbert Murray, two very respected figures. In answer to the question posed to the general public, how to preserve peace between nations, 10 million agreed that if one nation were to attack another, other nations should take steps to deal with the aggressor, mark, by way of sanctions and non-military measures.
On the 9th of February 1933, the Oxford Union passed by a majority of 275 to 173 a motion that, quote, in no circumstances would this House agree to fight for king and country. Britain was in no state to go to war. There were no air raid shelters, no radar, and an obsolete air force. There was a lack of modern anti-aircraft guns and modern equipment.
So what about the Dominions?
In 1914, the Dominions had almost without exception entered World War I, where they acquitted themselves with great courage. By now, 1938, however, their attitudes had changed. The Anzacs had particularly unhappy memories of Gallipoli. Those colonies which had achieved Dominion status wished to exercise their own independent judgment. A war in Europe did not appear to most of them to raise a direct threat to the existence of Britain and the Commonwealth. On 26th of September 1938, all the Dominions' High Commissioners expressed the view very strongly that acceptance of Hitler's terms was better than war. Finally, throughout the 1930s, the Labour opposition consistently voted against the defence estimates, and even in 1939 voted against conscription.
Perhaps this is a good moment for me to interject a few words about the resistance in Germany. Throughout the 1930s, a small collection, mainly of Germans, started resistance movements against the Hitler regime. They varied in status, they varied in their objectives, and they varied in their tactics. officers from the General Staff objected to the decisions about the Rhineland, the Anschluss with Austria, and Munich. It's fair to say that they were activated less by the morality of ethnic cleansing, as we would now call it, but rather more by the fear of unsuccessful military action, which, as General Staff, of course, they wouldn't welcome. Overall, the Gestapo posed a very real threat for everyone in Germany, but certainly the traditional military, such as my grandfather. Having to swear a personal oath of allegiance to Hitler, who was regarded with some, if you may say, class-informed distaste as a jumped-up corporal, it caused genuine distress to an awful lot of people. The civilian conspirators included well-known diplomats who were, however, in a position to give British and the French governments authentic details of Hitler's plans, which indeed they did. But they were, for a variety of reasons, not taken seriously. There were in Germany at that stage in the opposition divisions about what should be done in the event of a successful coup, about the fate of Hitler himself, his replacement, and the nature of another regime. Restoring the monarchy was one suggestion, which I'm sure my grandfather would have enthusiastically supported. One conspirator reminded Chamberlain of the Jacobites in the court of France in King William's time. And Chamberlain thus simply discounted his view. Oliver, leaving aside the German resistance for a moment, did you discover in the course of writing this book anything which changed your mind about Munich?
Yes. Just how gullible Chamberlain turned out to be. I thought, like most Britons, that the German Sudetens had been poorly treated. In fact, they'd been treated rather well. All might have been forgiven if Chamberlain had recognized the menace of Hitler. The idea of sending Lord Runciman to act as a mediator between the Sudeten Germans and the Czechoslovak government without the consent of the Czechoslovaks or the French was a disaster. Runciman was unable to differentiate between a democratically elected government and the Sudeten leaders who realized, encouraged by Germany, that the more they asked for, the more they would be conceded.
It has to be said that Chamberlain wasn't helped by his appointment of Neville Henderson as ambassador in Berlin, because the latter's uncritical dispatches merely demonstrated the old Foreign Office vice of going native. He had become very understanding of the German position. The humiliating occasion, which is pictured on the front of Oliver's book, of the England Football Association 11 being required to give the Nazi salute in the official match against a German 11 in Berlin in March 1938, was at Ambassador Henderson's personal insistence.
Chamberlain had no experience of foreign affairs, and during the summer of 1938, he made it clear that the Czechoslovaks had to accept settlement. Without a single word to the Czechoslovaks, he decided that he would unilaterally sort out the Czech problem with Hitler. On the 1st of September 1938, Chamberlain told the cabinet and the press that he was going to meet Hitler. He agreed to the far-reaching German proposals, which by late September now included cession and a plebiscite demand.
Cession of part of Czechoslovakia.
Yes, thank you. During meetings with Hitler, no discussions with the Czechoslovaks took place. They simply told that if they did not accept the proposals, both France and Britain would wash their hands of them.
What may surprise some of you is that Hitler himself didn't regard Munich as a triumph for him, because he wanted a fight. That had been denied to him because everybody kept on giving him whatever next he monstrously demanded. And much to the relief, however, of the general staff, who thought that they would lose if a fight started. So it's rather an odd situation. The meeting was set up by Italy and gave rise to a pretty dramatic reception in the House of Commons. The country was very divided at the point. Neither the Soviets nor the Czechoslovaks were invited to the Munich meeting. A number of Czechoslovaks officials who went were arrested and locked up during the official discussions. Now, by the Munich Agreement, Germany acquired the border fortifications, some 1,300 square miles of territory inhabited by some 800,000 Czechoslovaks and 2 million Sudetans, the German Sudetans. Additionally, the Czechs lost 3/4 of their industrial production. Germany set up some sort of international commission, which Germany dominated. And Germany also gave some guarantees. But Oliver says in his book that the French view of guarantees was that of Frederick II of Prussia, who said that all guarantees are like ouvrage de filigrane, more suited to satisfy the eye than to be of any particular value.
Chamberlain's views about Hitler were astonishingly naive. To take some examples, quote, "He gave me an assurance that this was his last demand." Another, "I've had a conversation with a man with whom I can do business." Quote, "I have an impression of a man who could be relied on when he had given me his word. Hitler would not deliberately deceive men whom he respected." Even after Munich, Chamberlain felt that Hitler had some respect for him. He wrote, "All the information that I get points in the direction of peace." How wrong he was. In less than a month, Hitler had occupied the whole of Czechoslovakia.
So that's not just the Czech bit, but the Slovak bit at the eastern end, which goes to just north of Vienna. Harold Nicholson, MP, wrote, "Chamberlain and his advisor, Sir Horace Wilson, stepped into diplomacy with the bright faithfulness of two curates entering a pub for the first time." They didn't distinguish between a social gathering and a roughhouse, nor did they realize that the tough guys assembled didn't speak or understand their language. Now, you may feel that it simply beggars belief that Chamberlain was able, on the 2nd of October 1939, a year after Munich, to write, and no doubt really believed, quote, "that what we did was to save the Czechoslovaks for a happier future. The Czechoslovaks then became subject to nearly 7 years of brutal Nazi occupation and a further long period of Soviet occupation. So, in conclusion, the Czechoslovaks were the unhappy victims of putting their trust in Britain and France. The Sudeten Germans were really rather a manufactured ground of complaint. And if the Czechoslovaks had been left to their own devices, they could hardly have been worse off than in the event they were. This was certainly the view of Churchill. If they had decided to fight, who knows what effect that would have had on the conspirators, on the generals, on Hitler, France, and Germany. It is an unknown series of facts full of conjecture.
France, they were the villains of Munich. They were the linchpin on which everything else depended. The French military lacked courage and the politicians lacked quality. The effect of the Spanish Civil War and the Abyssinian conflict no doubt also played its part. The French had nurtured the Czechoslovaks at Versailles, had entered into a treaty of alliance, and then spent the next decades trying to wash their hands of any responsibility. The judgment of one historian cannot be bettered. Quote, France behaved with consummate infamy.
Germany, it has to be said, was equally a villain. But Hitler did play his hand superbly. The so-called problems of the Sudeten was the ideal excuse for the long-planned invasion of Czechoslovakia. The desire for Lebensraum, living space, which he spelt out in full detail, should have come as no surprise to the West. His military success in the Rhineland and the Anschluss with Austria enabled him completely to emasculate the dissident generals. In August, he reminded them of Stalin's purges of his own military advisors. Quote, I too would not recoil from destroying 10,000. I do not want men of intelligence. I want men of brutality.
Britain's responsibility. It is frequently argued that Chamberlain gave the RAF time to modernize and win the Battle of Britain, and that fact justified Munich. But no one can be sure of that, and I cannot agree. What is important is that if only Chamberlain and other British politicians had appreciated the level of German ambition and recognized the naivety of putting their unfailing trust in Hitler's word, much would most certainly never have happened.
So the world is full of unanswered questions. But it's all, if you want to know more, which I'm sure you do, it's all in Oliver's book.
Well, it's very curious at my age to be the new kid on the block. But we have just short of 10 minutes to take questions from the audience now. And Henrietta has a microphone which she will walk around with. Are there any questions? Well, can I kick off then, perhaps, and use... no, please.
Thank you very much. They're really both entertaining and instructive. But I think what most people will be asking is, what are the lessons, if any, that we learn today in the West's response to the invasion of the Ukraine? Is Putin another Hitler? Should he be treated in a different way?
Your view is probably much more sensible than mine. I think Putin is in the same category as Hitler. Russia has always been determined to dominate Europe, and nothing, I believe, has changed except during the Glasnost regime. So I think treating them feebly is not the answer. I think we need to have good defense and intelligence and put our mind to what the real problem is. If we can negotiate, of course, that's a sensible thing to do. But going through what we went through in the 1930s is a horrendous way of approaching things.
What should we make of the limited public protest against it? We have the much vaunted Oxford by-election a month later, with the Labour and Liberal parties standing down and a effectively Popular Front candidate against Quentin Hogg, and the swing against the government was 3 or 4%, no more.
Well, unfortunately, popular opinion is popular opinion, and government has to face them. You've got to be very strong to start recruiting after the East Fulham by-election, or after we won't serve king and country again. And the Conservatives undoubtedly lost a lot during that period of time. Strong government requires attention to the important things, and sorting out the popular approach is very much more difficult than any of us can imagine. As for today, I mean, we look back over the last 3 months or 6 months, one can only regard that with horror.
Sue here, please.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I'm just to introduce myself. I'm from the Embassy of Slovakia. So for me, it is the history. It's even more interesting how the Britain is evaluating that time. I'm just wondering, since the relationships within Czechoslovakia at the time was even more complex and complicated, because there was this wish of Slovakians to get their future into their hands. So actually they played to a certain degree to the Hitler's will. But at least there was this strong recognition of the Russians, because Slovakia and the government of Slovakia, they never accepted that they should give any kind of hand to the other side, to the east. So I'm just wondering if you were able to get also the motives of Slovakia and Czech Republic, what really happened before Munich and immediately after Munich, because that's also a very interesting part which not answers the questions, but makes it a bit more clear.
I confess that I never really got fully into the difference between the Slovaks and the rest of Czechoslovakia. It was, I thought that the internal politics didn't appear to me to be terribly important. I'm sorry to say that, but that's how it appeared to me. There were outside factors which did affect them, and that going into the internal politics, which was very interesting. I mean, one tended to think that Masaryk and Benes ran the place for 30 years without any problem. They didn't. There were constant problems with different. The communists were always a problem. The Russians were an eternal problem in that part of the world. But the answer to your question is, I don't think that the Czechs could have done whatever capacity. They were Slovenes or Czechoslovakia could have done anything other than fall in with what was dictated by the great powers. But thank you for coming along and telling us your experience.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Geoffrey. The book is very full of detail and would seem to suggest a great deal of research. Can you tell us when you started it?
Yes, I read what books there were. I started this book actually, it must have been 20 years ago, and you can tell from the biography at the back that a lot of it is 1960 and so on. And it's only comparatively recently, I mean, the last 10 years, that encouraged by people, I resumed writing the book. What was it? I can't remember what the question was now.
When did you start?
I started it.
How long did it take you? Yes.
It took me a long time because, of course, although there are a lot of books, the original sources, I mean, the Czech original sources were, I had to read other people's translations of them. I could get hold of the diplomatic documents of the French Foreign Office and the German Foreign Office and the British Foreign Office. That was no problem. So internal memos were no problem. But the more detailed details of the Czechoslovak position was much more difficult to get hold of. And so I was thoroughly dependent on Czechoslovak books translated by exiles. That's right. It was a very slow start, and it was turned down a number of times. And eventually somebody decided they'd like to publish it.
I think we can take one more question if there is. Very well. That takes us up very closely to times when we've got a drinks reception. The pleasure is mine to say that your talk just now, and indeed both of you, thank you so much for an extremely interesting exposition of something that many of us didn't know a great deal about. As I was going to actually ask the same question as Geoffrey Nice, because clearly it's a hugely learned work. I praised it and sent it to various friends of mine. One academic who was a member of the United States Academy of Science, a very rare body, wrote back to me and said, "This is a wonderful work of scholarship."
Gosh, are they going to make a film?
So it is a marvelous read. I found it quite riveting. Thank you again so much for writing it.
Thank you very much.
For illuminating us in this way, and it shows what a wonderful advantage we have in this inn to have men of learning. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody. Well done. Well done. Yes, yes.